Hi again. Welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, Frederick VII became King of Denmark and Duke of Slesvig, Holstein and Lauenburg. His father had feared that Frederick would make a complete mess of things and had planned to introduce gradual conservative constitutional reforms to smooth the path for his son. But he died before he had a chance to do so, and just a few weeks after Frederick became king, Europe was swept by an unprecedented wave of revolutions, with people all over the continent demanding reforms, rights and freedoms. The Danes were no exception, but there was no need for a violent revolution in Copenhagen, since Frederick VII was more than happy to put an end to royal absolutism and introduce a constitution, as long as it meant that he wouldn't have to work as much as his father had. This move was extremely popular in Denmark, but not so much in other parts of Frederick's realm. Today, we'll have a look at how the political developments in Copenhagen were received in the duchies south of the so-called King's River, that demarcated the border between Denmark proper and Slesvig. Episode 132, To the Eider. As you're probably aware by now, the Oldenburg monarchs weren't merely kings of Denmark, but also dukes of Slesvig, Holstein and Lauenburg. They'd been dukes of Slesvig and Holstein for hundreds of years. Lauenburg, on the other hand, was a recent addition, a part of the complicated land swap after the loss of Norway. But since it was so small and so thoroughly German, it's not really relevant for today's episode. I'm sorry if I offend any Lauenburgian patriots, but from now on, Lauenburg will be implicitly included whenever I mention Holstein. After Norway had been taken over by Sweden, the duchies had become an increasingly important part of the so-called Unitary State. Not only did these territorial changes mean that 40% of the population ruled from Copenhagen were now German-speaking, but the duchies actually accounted for as much as half of the economy of the Unitary State. But exactly at the same time, the status of the duchies as parts of that unitary state was being called into question, on both sides of the border. Traditionally, there had never been much tension between Germans and Danes under the Oldenburg crown. No one had found it weird or problematic that the king's subjects spoke different languages. As long as they were all good Protestants, everything was perfectly manageable. It was only as a consequence of the French Revolution in the late 1700s that nationalism really became a political force to reckon with, and politicians, intellectuals, and soon enough people more broadly started to attach increasing importance to various nationalities, arguing that every nation had the right to independence. That kind of talk sounds good in theory, and it was used with considerable success by the Norwegians when they wrote their constitution in 1814. But, as I've noted in previous episodes, it threatened to break up old states, based on the principle of loyalty to a dynasty, when they were faced with demands from various peoples within that state to govern themselves. It was a challenge for the large empires, such as the Habsburg realm, but also for the Unitary State, and it didn't help that in the duchies the position of Danish had been weakened in the last few generations. The people north of the river Eider that marked the border between Slesvig and Holstein had been Danish-speaking for as long as anyone could remember, with small pockets of German speakers predominantly in the towns and among the large landowners. But lately, a broader Germanization process had been underway. German was the language of commerce, administration, and, increasingly importantly, education. Obviously, this was a threat to the Danish character of Slesvig, and it didn't take many generations for the population in the southern parts of the duchy to adopt not only the German language, but also a German identity. These now Germanized former Danes often also favored the German nationalist perspective on the issue of how Slesvig should be governed. For a long time, this gradual shift toward Germanization didn't constitute a serious threat to the kings in Copenhagen, though. Frederick VI and Christian VIII had enjoyed solid support from the real power players in the duchies, namely the landed nobility. These aristocrats often owned land on both sides of the Eider, so, for practical reasons, they had a clear personal interest to keep the two duchies unified, just like King Christian I had promised the local nobility when he became the first duke, all the way back in 1460. The aristocrats in Slesvig and Holstein had an additional reason to back their feudal lord, the Duke/King in Copenhagen. Namely, that as long as the absolutist system held firm, they, that is the conservative noblemen, controlled the duchies. They knew that the German nationalist politicians and intellectuals in the cities and towns all over the duchies who clamored for Schleswig to join Holstein in the German Confederation wanted to establish liberal constitutional rule in Schleswig and Holstein. And that would spell the end of aristocratic influence over the duchies, or at the very least, seriously undermine it. The German aristocracy would much rather continue to pay homage to an absent lord in Copenhagen than to hand over actual power to liberal commoners in Kiel, even if they did speak German. So, as long as the absolutist system held firm, the conservative aristocracy in Slesvig and Holstein remained loyal to the Duke in Copenhagen. But after 1848, when the Danes abolished absolutism and the new king, Frederick VII, so openly sympathized with the liberal Danish politicians and their idea of incorporating Schleswig into the Kingdom of Denmark, the landowning aristocracy in the duchies felt the situation had changed radically. They were no longer willing to support the crown if the crown wasn't going to have their back and honor the old promise not to divide the duchies. The old Danish government had been full of conservatives who were focused on careful reforms in keeping the Unitary State together. The new government that was appointed in March 1848 and therefore called the March Cabinet was dominated by nationalist liberals. They had completely different priorities. They wanted a new liberal constitution, even if it would lead to the collapse of the Unitary State. The March Cabinet was all for the Eider program that I mentioned last time. That is the plan to incorporate Schleswig into Denmark, moving the border south all the way to the river Eider. Anything south of the border, namely the duchies Holstein and Lauenburg, should be allowed to cut all ties to Copenhagen and just be a part of the German Confederation. After all, the people living south of the Eider were Germans, so that would make most sense. The fact that many of those who lived north of the Eider also consider themselves German nowadays was neither here nor there. Their ancestors had been Danish, so they should be re-Danified. As we covered last time, the king, influenced by his friends and his third wife, supported the government's position about the expansion of Denmark to include all the land north of the river Eider. And so did most of Danish society, from the nobility down to the peasants. But even though this announcement was super popular in Denmark, the reception in the duchies was far more mixed. The German majority population was outraged and rejected the idea of dividing Schleswig and Holstein, a clear violation of Christian I's promise from 1460. The reaction in Kiel, the capital of Holstein, was immediate and drastic. Revolt. The local politicians, just as liberal and just as nationalist as the ones in Copenhagen, but German nationalists, not Danish, proclaimed a government of their own, independent of Copenhagen, for both Schleswig and Holstein. They also announced their intention of writing a constitution of their own, again for both Schleswig and Holstein. And the conservative landed nobility in the duchies did nothing to stop them, since they thought a liberal government of Germans in Kiel ruling both duchies together was a lesser evil than Schleswig and Holstein governed separately by two separate liberal governments. But the members of the Kiel government realized the odds were against them. If possible, they preferred a diplomatic solution to the conflict with the Danes, so they sent representatives to Copenhagen to present their demands. On March 24, 1848, Orla Lehmann, the man who'd penned the Eider program, met with the representatives from Kiel, but he was far less interested in diplomacy than they were. On behalf of the government and the king, he rejected the suggestion that Schleswig should join the German Confederation and told the German delegation that the king had every intention to strengthen the indissoluble bond between Denmark and Schleswig and to establish a free constitution for Denmark, to the Eider. That meant that the war was now inevitable. But, to be perfectly honest, the response from the Danish government didn't exactly surprise the representatives from the duchies. They had been expecting a hard no, and they had planned accordingly. On the very same day that they declared their rebellion, the provisional government in Kiel had sent a military unit to attack Rendsborg Fortress, the most important Danish military installation in the duchies. The 5th Lauenburger Rifle Corps and a group of students from Kiel University marched on the fortress. They were commanded by the Minister of War in the new Kiel government, a certain Prince Frederick of Slesvig, Holstein, Sonderburg, Augustenburg, who was actually related to the King of Denmark. The family was a cadet branch of the Oldenburg dynasty, and the prince was the nephew of King Frederick VI and the brother-in-law of Christian VIII. When the German troops reached the fortress, they found that the defenders hadn't realized the gravity of the situation. The gates were open, so they could just march in without firing a single shot. Once inside, the prince read a proclamation to the soldiers of the fortress, explaining that Slesvig and Holstein had broken with Copenhagen, and from now on they would govern themselves. The soldiers, who were mostly local Germans, thought this was a splendid idea, and readily joined the new rebellion. So, in a few bloodless minutes, the Kiel government had gained not only a couple of battalions of infantry and an artillery regiment, they had also seized all the provisions, weapons, ammunition, and a bunch of cash that the Danes had kept at Rendsborg for safekeeping. The Danish officers who were stationed at Rendsborg were allowed to leave and go home to Denmark, but before they did, they had to swear not to fight against Slesvig and Holstein in the war that had just started. From a Danish perspective, the conflict that started with the bloodless takeover of Rendsborg was a civil war within the Unitary State. But that doesn't mean it didn't attract foreign attention. On the contrary, various powers in Europe monitored the developments with grave concern. The British Foreign Minister, Lord Palmerston, is supposed to have quipped, "Only 3 people have ever really understood the Schleswig-Holstein business. The Prince Consort, who is dead, a German professor who's gone mad, and I, who've forgotten all about it." Lord Palmerston may have exaggerated somewhat, but the way the great powers lined up and their motives for doing so were a little complicated. Still, I'll do my very best to give you a quick overview. Great powers like Britain and Russia couldn't care less who actually governed Schleswig and Holstein, but they were worried about how a war between Denmark and members of the German Confederation might affect the passage in and out of the Baltic Sea, and that was of vital importance to both London and St. Petersburg. Lord Palmerston and the British government were afraid of Prussia taking control over Danish waters, especially the Øresund Strait, thereby being able to stop international shipping in and out of the Baltic Sea. The Brits preferred to have a relatively weak power, such as Denmark, controlling these sea lanes, since Copenhagen could be expected to be much more easily convinced to take British interests into account than Berlin would. And if they were to cause trouble, the British Navy could always bombard Copenhagen again, an operation that would be considerably trickier with regards to Berlin. For this reason, the Brits supported the Danes because they feared that if Denmark lost the war, Prussia might not only annex Schleswig and Holstein, but maybe even the rest of Denmark. The thinking at the imperial court in St. Petersburg was similar, and also Emperor Nicholas I supported Denmark because he wanted to counteract Prussian influence in the Baltic Sea, and especially over the Øresund Strait. Nicholas also feared that if Denmark lost the war, Copenhagen might decide to join a Scandinavian union together with Sweden. Such a Scandinavian state, including Denmark, Norway and Sweden, would have considerable military muscle and might rival the Russian Navy in the Baltic Sea, and maybe even threaten Russian control over Finland. Remember, at this point, Finland had been under Russian control for less than 40 years, so the Russians still feared attempts of a Swedish reconquest. Also, France and Austria supported Denmark, but not because they cared about the access to the Baltic Sea primarily. They were just afraid of Prussia's growing power and worried that if the Prussians would support Schleswig and Holstein and then win the war against Denmark, this would lead to a unification of the German Confederation into a centralized state controlled from Berlin. Both in Paris and in Vienna, this was seen as a nightmare scenario. But since both France and Austria were in the middle of handling the revolutions brought on by the Springtime of the Peoples in 1848, they were in no position to aid Denmark in any substantial way, beyond sending moral support and good vibes to Copenhagen. To complicate matters, Britain actually supported a strong Prussia, just as long as they stayed away from Denmark. In London, the government hoped that a unified Germany ruled from Berlin would counterbalance France, the continental power that the Brits considered to be their biggest rival, both in Europe and in the world. Russia too wanted to see a strong Prussia, as long as Berlin didn't crush Denmark. Emperor Nicholas I and King Frederick William of Prussia were actually brothers-in-law, and Nicholas was a huge admirer of Prussian militarism. The Holy League, that club of conservative or autocrats that we've talked about before, was still a thing, and the Russian emperor thought that the Prussian king was a much more dependable ally than the emperor in Vienna, whose throne was wobbling considerably because of the revolutions that were taking place all over the Habsburg Empire. So it was no secret that Emperor Nicholas thought a united Germany under Prussian leadership would be a splendid idea. All of this was obviously known in Berlin as well, and even though the Prussian government didn't want to risk an open conflict with any of the other great powers, they were pretty convinced that at least the Russians would be okay with Berlin taking control over both Schleswig and Holstein, just as long as the German soldiers didn't threaten the continued existence of Denmark. So the rebels in Schleswig and Holstein were banking on backup from the German Confederation, especially from Prussia. But the Danes weren't worried. They were also expecting international assistance, but not from the French, who were busy handling the collapse of the monarchy and the establishment of the Second Republic. No, in the lead up to the war, the Danes were hoping for Swedish military support. Now you may ask yourself, wait, what? Haven't I spent 130 odd episodes describing how Sweden and Denmark have been at each other's throats, taking every opportunity to attack each other? And now all of a sudden the Danes expect the Swedes to come to their aid? Were they delusional? No. I mean, yes, but not in the way you might think. You see, even though Scandinavia had been rocked by war as late as 1814, a new sense of common roots had been growing in the last few decades. This new sense of togetherness is called Scandinavism, and the idea was first put forward in literary and intellectual circles in the end of the 18th century. Even though the war where Norway switched hands hurt the idea, it didn't kill it, and Scandinavism grew even stronger in the following decades. Universities, especially the ones in Copenhagen and in Lund, were important centers of Scandinavism, and students would frequently visit each other, have dinners, drink together, and give fiery speeches about how the Scandinavian peoples, so long sundered by war, should join together in fraternal love and solidarity and blah blah blah. The visits across the Øresund Strait were facilitated by the establishment of the first steamboat connection between Copenhagen and Malmö in 1828. In 1839, the Danish Scandinavist Frederick Barefoot started to publish a magazine called Brage and Idun, where he argued for Scandinavian unity. The publication was named after two Old Norse gods, and that wasn't a coincidence. Scandinavists liked to stress the common Old Norse heritage of all the Scandinavian peoples, drawing heavily on the old myths and sagas in their own work, whether it was literature, painting, sculpture, or something else. It took a while for Scandinavism to break out of the academic and intellectual bubble and enter the political sphere. This wasn't only because of all the badwill created by the Swedish takeover of Norway, even though that certainly didn't help to bring Danes and Norwegians closer to the Swedes. Another reason was that Bernadotte actively discouraged Scandinavism. He distrusted the idea, and in 1837 he felt forced to have instructions circulated to all Swedish embassies and consulates around the world, warning them to stay well clear of anything that smelled of Scandinavism. But Bernadotte died in 1844, and even though his son and heir, Oscar, at first continued his father's anti-Scandinavist line, he eventually warmed to the idea of closer ties between the Scandinavian peoples. In Denmark, Scandinavism was a part of the national liberal agenda, and it had been ever since the 1830s. Scandinavists had long been taking a keen interest in the Danish population in Schleswig, who they felt were under threat of Germanification, and Scandinavists felt it was the duty of all Scandinavians to back Denmark in the country's just cause against the Germans. Also in Sweden and Norway, Scandinavists tended to agree. Especially students held meetings where they worked themselves up with all those rousing speeches about the unity of the Scandinavian peoples and how crucial it was for the future of Scandinavia that the Danes save the people of Schleswig from the German threat. This process had been going on for years, as the Schleswig question had been heating up throughout the 1840s. For instance, in 1843, students from Copenhagen and Lund held marches to Uppsala, north of Stockholm, where they met to drink and to listen to the usual speeches about the necessity of Nordic unity. These kinds of student events shaped public opinion. Remember, back then, only a privileged few could afford a university education, so anyone who was a student was more or less bound to find himself in an influential position in society after he graduated. By the way, this was also why the Russian authorities kept such a close eye on what the students at the university in Turku were up to, and why they decided to move the academic center of Finland to the new university in Helsinki, further away from the dangerous Swedish influence and closer to Russia. You may remember that I talked about that back in episode 121, the Grand Duchy. Anyway, Scandinavist sentiments had been gathering momentum for years by the time Frederick VII became king. There had even been speculations that since Frederick was childless, he could adopt King Oscar I of Sweden, thereby uniting the three Scandinavian crowns on one head again for the first time since the breakup of the Kalmar Union way back in episode 71. So, when the war broke out in March 1848, many national liberal Danes fully expected Sweden to come to Denmark's aid in the struggle against the Germans. But even though several private individuals from Sweden and Norway volunteered to join the fighting, the Swedish government refused to send regular troops. The king, Oscar I, was under heavy pressure from public opinion, not least in the press, to do more, but he only ordered Swedish army units to concentrate in Scania. He and the Swedish government refused to participate in the war as long as the Germans didn't cross into Denmark proper. So in the end, the Danish hopes of Scandinavian solidarity and Swedish military assistance in the duchies were dashed. Still, many Danes looked forward to the upcoming conflict. They felt that they'd been attacked by the Germans, and they expected a swift victory that would right a historic wrong, reuniting the population of Schleswig with their Danish brethren, whether they wanted to or not. I don't want to seem too hyperbolic here, but the war was seen as a part of the rebirth of the Danish nation after the loss of Norway and the stifling last years of absolutism under Frederick VI and Christian VIII. For context, remember that all of this was happening in parallel with the Constitutional Assembly getting together to write that first ever constitution for Denmark. In the duchies, the enthusiasm for the conflict was equally strong. The Germans felt betrayed by the Danes, who had reneged on an almost 400-year-old promise and had tried to divide Slesvig and Holstein. Now they were eager to follow up the success they had had when they captured the Rendsburg fortress without a fight and advanced on the city of Flensburg in Schleswig, which was captured by a unit of volunteers on March 31st. But only a few days later, the Danish Navy landed 7,000 soldiers east of the city. The Germans feared that they'd be surrounded and cut off, so they decided to retreat. But they weren't quick enough, and the Danish soldiers caught up with them, forcing them to fight the first pitched battle of the war at Bove on April 9th. The Germans were once again commanded by Frederick of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Augustenburg, who had taken Rendsburg. This time he wasn't as successful though. To begin with, he showed up late, 2 hours after the battle had begun, and when he did, he wasn't able to turn the tide of the fighting, and the Germans lost. But just because they'd won one battle didn't mean the Danes had won the war. Far from it. Already 3 days later, the Assembly of the German Confederation recognized the provisional government set up by the German rebels in Kiel. Worse yet for the Danes, the Assembly also urged Prussia to aid the Germans in Slesvig and Holstein to secure their territory and throw out the Danish forces. The Prussian army had just been waiting for that signal, and less than a week later they had already crossed the Danevirke defensive line. By the end of April, all of Slesvig and Holstein was in Prussian hands, and in the beginning of May, the Germans crossed the border into Denmark proper, taking Fredericia in southern Jutland on May 2nd. Even though the military campaign went swimmingly for the Prussians, the decision to send troops had been preceded by a fair bit of hand-wringing and hesitation on the part of King Frederick William IV. He wasn't exactly what you'd call a decisive monarch, but following the blow to their prestige that his dynasty and his government had suffered during the springtime of the peoples, that had sent rioters into the streets of Berlin, he decided to commit troops to the war in the duchies. His foreign minister, who was an ardent supporter of the war, had assured the king that the Prussian army could conquer Schleswig and Holstein in 8 days. And he'd been almost right. The Prussian occupation of the duchies had been swift. But the Prussian foreign minister had made another, more serious mistake. He'd banked on the other great powers just accepting the Prussian conquest as a fait accompli and not make a fuss about it if it was done fast enough. That assumption soon turned out to be completely detached from reality. The other great powers watched with increasing alarm how the Prussian army sliced through Slesvig and Holstein as a hot knife through melted Danish butter. The French couldn't do much since they were only just recovering from their own revolution. The Habsburgs were also off balance, but they marked their distance by refusing to help the Prussians in any way, even though they were both allies and a kind of Germans. The British threatened to send the navy to Danish waters to keep the Prussians away. But it was the Russians that really managed to hammer home the message to the Prussians that they needed to calm down. Fast. The Russian ambassador in Berlin delivered a note to King Frederick William IV from his brother-in-law, the Russian emperor. In his note, Nicholas stressed that he considered Prussian troops approaching Jutland an act of aggression against a Russian ally, and that if the German soldiers didn't turn around immediately, the Russians would have no choice but to intervene on the Danish side in this war. The Empress of Russia, that is Frederick William's sister, also wrote to her brother telling him that her husband the Tsar wasn't bluffing. He was ready to go to war unless Berlin backed down. The Russian threats had the intended effect, and Frederick William now pulled the classic card used by absolute monarchs everywhere when they make mistakes. He blamed his advisors, claiming he'd been misled to approve Prussia joining the war. The Prussian king proceeded to recall his army from Slesvig and Holstein, but that didn't mean his troubles ended, because now he was attacked by German nationalists throughout the German Confederation who thought it was nothing short of scandalous that Prussia, the largest and most powerful German state by far, refused to lend a helping hand to a fellow member state of the Confederation. King Frederick William didn't know what to do, but in the end he was saved by the diplomatic efforts of King Oscar I of Sweden, who coaxed the two warring sides to sign an armistice agreement in Malmö in August 1848. 2 months later, the two sides started to talk to reach a permanent peace, but in early 1849 the negotiations broke down and the truce ended in February. On April 3, 1849, the fighting resumed when the Danes went on a renewed offensive. They were doing much better now when the Prussians no longer supported the rebellious duchies, but the Danish forces were still unable to achieve a decisive victory on the battlefield. After another year of fighting that led nowhere, the Prussians suggested an end to hostilities and a peace agreement based on the status quo ante, meaning that everything would go back to the way it had been before the war started. The sides would agree to disagree and negotiate a solution to the conflict at a later date. The British were skeptical, and the foreign minister, Lord Palmerston, noted, correctly, that such an agreement would be pointless, since it would solve nothing. The Russian emperor, who was disgusted by what he saw as his brother-in-law's weakness, and who really disliked rebels, offered to send Russian troops to crush the rebellion in the duchies on Denmark's behalf. So the fighting went on, parallel to negotiations. A number of treaties and declarations were actually signed, but that didn't mean the fighting stopped. In the end, neither side was strong enough to win the war on the battlefield. The Danes couldn't establish their border on the Eider, and the Germans couldn't push the Danes out of the duchies. And since the great powers didn't want a protracted war, they stepped in. Eventually, they put enough pressure on the warring parties to convince them to stop the fighting and to negotiate for a real deal instead. The parties met in England, and on May 8th, 1852, they signed the so-called London Protocol. The protocol was agreed upon both by the great powers Britain, France, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, as well as Denmark and Sweden. The hope was that with such broad recognition, the agreement would hold longer. The protocol basically wound the clock back to the situation before March 1848, scrapping the Eider program. Slesvig and Holstein and Lauenburg remained parts of the Unitary State together with Denmark, and King Frederick VII would still be the reigning duke. The 1849 Danish constitution would not be valid in Slesvig, and the duchies remained a united, autonomous unit governed together. But that wasn't everything. The London Protocol also settled the issue of Danish succession. As you know by now, Frederick VII didn't have any children, and there were no other close male heirs that could carry on the bloodline. There was only his old uncle Ferdinand, and he didn't have any children either. To solve the issue, and to avoid the Scandinavist wet dream of Oscar I inheriting the Danish crown, thereby creating a Nordic superstate that would threaten Russia's interest in the Baltic region, Emperor Nicholas I suggested that a Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg should be moved up in the line of succession, placing him right after Uncle Ferdinand. The Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg family was a cadet branch of the Oldenburg dynasty, and to further boost his claim to the Danish crown, beside the fact that his name was already Christian, he also happened to be married to Louise of Hesse-Kassel, whose mother was the closest living female relative of King Frederick VII of Denmark. Everyone thought this was a splendid idea, and in July 1853, the Danish law of succession was amended to make Christian number 2 in the line of succession, after old Uncle Ferdinand. This effectively put an end to the Scandinavist dream of a united Nordic kingdom, and together with Sweden's failure to come to Denmark's aid when it was needed, this kind of threw a wet blanket over Scandinavism for the years to come, at least from a political perspective. In culture, scholarship, and fiery student speeches, the idea of a common Scandinavian past, present, and future lived on. In the summer of 1852, when the dust settled, the duchies were back to governing themselves as a unit, and Denmark was governed in accordance with a new constitution. But at the same time, everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The underlying issue that sparked the war in the first place wasn't solved, and neither Danes nor Germans were happy. Danish nationalists hadn't given up hope of implementing the Eider program, and in Holstein, German nationalists still wanted independence for themselves and for Schleswig. Not exactly the perfect recipe for a peaceful future. And if you don't believe me, just tune in next time and I'll tell you all about it. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.